My name is Willow. I am 28 years old, and as a registered nurse, I am usually the one providing care, not receiving humiliation. Yet there I was standing in the center of a magnificent penthouse overlooking San Francisco Bay, but I wasn't there as a guest. Instead, I was forced into the stiff, uncomfortable uniform of a hired server, a position my stepmother had ensured was the only job I could get. Estelle, whose malice was as sharp as the diamonds she wore, had maneuvered herself into total control of our family assets, including the medical trust for my younger brother Leo. I was quietly weaving through the crowd, carefully balancing a heavy tray of champagne, when Estelle suddenly blocked my path. Her cold eyes fixed on my face before she raised her glass and purposefully splashed the contents directly into my eyes. The sophisticated atmosphere shattered instantly, replaced by a suffocating silence, as red wine dripped from my chin and pooled on the polished white marble floor beneath my feet. Estelle turned to the stunned crowd, her voice loud and clear, as she introduced me as the shameful, estranged daughter whom the family had rightfully cast out. She gripped my arm, her fingernails digging deep into my skin as she hissed a terrifying ultimatum that if I didn't serve every table perfectly, she would cut off Leo's emergency heart treatment immediately. I swallowed the burning humiliation, slowly wiped the sticky fluid from my face with a napkin, and stared directly back into her cold, dead eyes. What she didn't know was that while I was forced into this uniform, I was not broken, and I had used my nurse's training to observe every detail of this party. My plan for Leo's survival was already in motion, and I had exactly 30 minutes to execute it. What is the truth about Willow's identity and her brother's fate? Don't forget to hit the subscribe button and leave a comment below so you don't miss the dramatic resolution to this high-stakes confrontation. I stepped into the small storage room behind the banquet hall to double-check the medication bags I had carefully prepared for my brother. The silence in this cramped space offered a brief sanctuary from the suffocating atmosphere of the party, where my dignity had been stripped away. As I organized the vials, my mind drifted back to the agonizing months after my father's sudden passing, when everything changed for the worse. My stepmother Estelle had skillfully manipulated his fragile state during his final days to seize total control over our family estate. She managed to sideline my grandmother Martha, who was my father's biological mother and the rightful owner of this very penthouse. Through a series of legal loopholes and psychological pressure, Estelle had effectively trapped Martha in a state of forced dependency. The heavy metal door creaked open and Estelle marched in with a look of pure disdain that made my skin crawl. Without uttering a single word, she swept her hand across the small table, sent the tray of food I had prepared for Leo crashing to the dusty floor. She looked down at the mess with a smirk, then turned her cold gaze toward my nursing scrubs peeking out from under my server's apron. Estelle commented that my choice of profession was the lowest form of labor, a pathetic attempt to play hero while she held all the real power. She reached into her silk clutch and pulled out a legal document that I recognized immediately as a formal waiver of my inheritance rights. Estelle tossed the paper onto the table and told me that if I wanted Leo to receive his next week of specialized heart treatment, I would sign it without question. My heart hammered against my ribs, but I forced my hands to remain steady as I looked at the pen she offered. I knew that signing this meant giving up any legal claim to my father's legacy, essentially handing her the victory she had been chasing for years. However, while she was distracted by her own perceived triumph, I reached into the pocket of my apron and activated the micro-recording device hidden inside my server's brooch. Estelle began to boast about how easy it had been to trick my father into signing the revised will while he was heavily medicated. She laughed as she described the clever ways she had diverted Leo's medical fund to pay for her own lavish lifestyle and designer collections. Every word of her confession was being captured, a digital trap that she was walking into with absolute confidence. I remained silent, letting her arrogance fuel a monologue that provided more evidence than I could have ever hoped to gather on my own. She eventually grew bored with my lack of reaction and leaned in close to deliver her final chilling ultimatum for the night. Estelle whispered that if I expected to see Leo alive through the night, I would return to the hall and perform my duties on my knees if she demanded it. She adjusted her pearls, took one last look at the ruined food on the floor, and swept out of the room without looking back. I stood in the dim light for a long moment, focused on slowing my breathing until the shaky feeling in my limbs finally subsided. I reached into my pocket to verify that the recording was saved and encrypted, ensuring that her voice was preserved in high definition. With the data secured, I straightened my uniform and prepared to step back into the bright lights of the banquet hall. The battle was no longer just about survival, because I finally possessed the evidence needed to destroy the empire she had built on lies. By 7:30 in the evening, the luxury penthouse was filled with the sound of classical music and the rich aroma of expensive food as the guests officially began the banquet. I moved through the crowded hall with a heavy tray of wine, carefully navigating between groups of people who were laughing and drinking without a care in the world. I did my best to avoid the disdainful glances from Estelle's socialite friends, who looked at my server's uniform as if it were a stain on the elegant surroundings. The weight of the tray made my muscles ache, but I kept my posture straight and my expression neutral to avoid drawing any unnecessary attention to myself. Every time I passed a guest, I caught fragments of conversations about wealth and influence that felt completely disconnected from the reality of my brother's hospital room. The family's benefactor, a billionaire named Mr. Dalton, appeared at the entrance of the ballroom with an aura of power that seemed to command the respect of everyone in the room. He was a man known for his sharp intellect and his deep involvement in the city's most prestigious charitable foundations, making him a crucial figure in Estelle's social climbing plans. As he began to walk through the hall, I noticed him observing the staff with a strange intensity, as if he were looking for something specific among the sea of faces. Estelle quickly noticed his arrival and rushed over to greet him, her face twisting into a fake smile that didn't reach her cold eyes. She caught my eye and gestured for me to bring a fresh tray of champagne over to where they were standing near the grand piano. Estelle intentionally called me over to introduce me to Mr. Dalton as the clumsiest and most incompetent server she had ever been forced to hire for a private event. She laughed as she told him that I was a charity case who couldn't find work anywhere else because of my supposed lack of discipline and basic skills. I remained silent as I held the tray steady, but I shifted my grip just enough to expose the long, jagged scar that stretched across my inner wrist. This mark was a permanent reminder of the terrifying night on the highway 2 years ago when I had risked my life to save a stranger from a burning vehicle. Mr. Dalton suddenly stopped mid-sentence when his gaze landed on the distinct shape of the scar under the bright chandelier light. He reached out as if to touch it, his eyes narrowing with a sudden realization that made the air between us feel incredibly heavy. The billionaire stared at the scar for a long time before he asked me to stand perfectly still so that he could observe the mark more closely from another angle. Estelle's smile faltered for a moment as she noticed the serious expression on his face, but she quickly tried to brush off the tension with a dismissive comment. She let out a soft, mocking laugh and told Mr. Dalton not to pay any attention to it, claiming it was just a scar from my days of being a reckless and troubled teenager. Mr. Dalton's voice dropped to a low, dangerous tone that silenced the nearby guests as he looked Estelle directly in the eyes. He asked her if she was absolutely certain about that, because he felt this scar was very familiar, like a vivid memory that he would never be able to forget for the rest of his life. I felt a surge of hope in my chest as I realized that the man I had saved that night was finally standing right in front of me. By 7:45 in the evening, the air inside the penthouse grew noticeably tense as Estelle began to sense the shifting attention of the guests toward me. She noticed the way Mr. Dalton continued to watch my movements with a furrowed brow, his curiosity clearly piqued by the mysterious scar on my wrist. To regain her sense of dominance and humiliate me further, Estelle suddenly reached out and swept a bowl of hot soup off a nearby table, letting it shatter loudly against the floor. A hush fell over the surrounding crowd as the liquid splattered across her expensive designer shoes and the pristine white marble. With a sharp, commanding voice that carried across the ballroom, she ordered me to get down on my knees and clean the mess off her footwear immediately. I felt the eyes of dozens of wealthy strangers burning into my back as I slowly lowered myself to the ground in front of her. As I knelt there, I could feel the intense waves of triumph and satisfaction radiating from the woman standing so arrogantly above me. She looked down at me with a smirk that revealed her absolute delight in seeing me reduced to such a lowly position in front of the city's elite. However, while I kept my head bowed in a show of false submission, I reached into the hidden fold of my apron where I had tucked a small folded piece of paper. This note contained Leo's emergency patient identification code and a brief medical summary that only a professional would recognize as legitimate evidence of malpractice. As I reached out to wipe the floor near Mr. Dalton's chair, I secretly slid the tiny note under the base of his crystal wine glass with a single fluid motion. He didn't say a word, but I felt him shift slightly in his seat as he noticed the small white corner of the paper peeking out from beneath his drink. Estelle wasn't finished with her display of power, and she purposefully shifted her weight to press the sharp heel of her shoe directly onto my fingers as I worked. She leaned down toward my ear, her voice a poisonous whisper that was meant only for me to hear in the middle of the crowded room. She hissed that this was the only price I would ever pay for daring to hold my head high in a house that no longer belonged to me or my brother. The pain in my hand was sharp and throbbing, but I refused to give her the satisfaction of hearing me cry out or seeing me flinch under her heel. I waited until she finished her quiet threat before I finally looked up at her with a calm, steady gaze that seemed to catch her completely off guard. Estelle barked her orders for everyone to hear. Clean it thoroughly, because a useless person like you only deserves to be at my feet exactly like this. I looked up at her, meeting her cold eyes with a serenity that masked the storm brewing inside my chest, as I replied calmly, "You should enjoy this feeling while it lasts, Estelle, because this is the very last time you will ever have the chance to stand higher than me." My response caused a visible flicker of confusion to cross her face, but before she could retaliate, Mr. Dalton reached out and picked up his wine glass. He quickly unfolded the small piece of paper I had left for him, his eyes scanning the medical codes and the names of the medications listed there. His expression transformed from curiosity to a dark, simmering anger as the implications of the note began to settle into his mind. Without warning, he slammed his glass back down onto the table with such force that several guests jumped in surprise at the sudden sharp noise. The sound echoed through the banquet hall, signaling that the tide was finally beginning to turn in a direction Estelle was not prepared for. At 8 o'clock, the classical music suddenly died out as Mr. Dalton stood up abruptly and demanded that everyone in the room remain silent for a moment. The sudden transition from festive chatter to an eerie stillness made every guest turn toward the head table with confused expressions. Mr. Dalton did not wait for an invitation to speak, as he publicly questioned Willow's true identity while staring directly at Estelle with a look of intense disappointment. He demanded that Estelle explain why a woman who deserved the highest honors for her bravery was currently being treated like a common servant in this house. The billionaire then began to recount a harrowing story from 2 years ago, describing a rainy night on a dark highway when his vehicle had been engulfed in flames. He told the stunned crowd that while every other witness had run away in fear of an explosion, it was Willow who had risked her own life to pull him from the wreckage. Estelle's face turned a ghostly shade of pale as she realized the man she had been trying to impress was the very person Willow had saved. She began to stammer and shake her head in frantic denial, claiming that Willow was a professional liar who had forged her medical records to gain sympathy from strangers. Estelle insisted that Mr. Dalton must have mistaken me for someone else, because the lighting on that rainy night was poor and his memory was likely clouded by trauma. She turned to the guests and tried to laugh off the accusation, but her voice was high-pitched and lacked the usual confidence that she used to manipulate people. The guests began to whisper among themselves as they watched the powerful woman unravel right in front of their eyes, while I stood perfectly still near the center of the hall. I did not let her words shake my resolve, and instead I slowly stood up straight and began to unbutton the heavy server's apron that had felt like a cage all evening. I reached into a hidden reinforced pocket in my undershirt and pulled out my professional nurse's license, which was encased in a clear protective sleeve. I held the credential high so that the light from the chandeliers reflected off the official state seal and my professional photograph. Mr. Dalton stepped forward to testify further, his voice booming across the room as he recalled the specific details of his rescue that only his savior could possibly know. Mr. Dalton spoke loudly to the entire room. This girl performed chest compressions on me for 30 minutes in the middle of a torrential downpour to keep me breathing, and you dare to call her spoiled and useless. Estelle stepped back, as if she had been slapped, her hands gripping the edge of the table so tightly that her knuckles turned white under her expensive rings. She stammered, "That is impossible. She is just an uneducated child who never finished anything, and you have clearly been deceived by her lies." The people in the ballroom began to move away from Estelle as they recognized the blatant deception in her voice and compared it to my calm, professional demeanor. They saw the official nurse's badge in my hand and realized that the person they had been mocking all night was actually a highly skilled medical professional. The whispers turned into a low roar of disapproval directed at the woman who had tried to humiliate her own stepdaughter for sport. I felt a profound sense of relief as the mask Estelle had worn for years finally began to crumble under the weight of the truth I had finally revealed. At 8:15 in the evening, I gave a firm nod toward the main entrance, and my lawyer, Mr. Miller, stepped into the banquet hall, carrying a thick stack of legal folders. The crowd parted as he walked directly toward the head table with a professional composure that signaled the end of Estelle's carefully constructed facade. I reached into my pocket and activated the high-quality speaker system I had secretly connected to my recording device earlier that afternoon. The entire room fell into a stunned silence as Estelle's own voice began to echo through the hall, clearly admitting to the intentional switching of my father's final will. The recording was undeniable, capturing her boastful description of how she had systematically reduced the vital heart medication intended for Martha to keep her in a weakened state. Mr. Miller opened the first folder and began to present a series of verified bank statements that documented a massive, unauthorized drainage of Leo's medical trust fund. He pointed out several large wire transfers that Estelle had funneled into her private accounts to cover her gambling debts and purchase a fleet of luxury vehicles. The guests gasped as the lawyer explained how she had left my brother's life hanging by a thread just to fund her own vanity and social standing. Estelle tried to snatch the papers from his hand, but she was interrupted by a sudden movement from behind the heavy velvet curtains near the balcony. Martha stepped out into the light, looking remarkably alert and healthy, which caused Estelle to stagger backward in absolute terror, as if she had seen a ghost. My grandmother walked toward the center of the room with a steady grace that proved she was no longer under the influence of the sedatives Estelle had been secretly administering. Martha looked her stepdaughter-in-law in the eye and stated with a powerful clarity that she had been aware of the betrayals for a very long time. Estelle's knees buckled and she collapsed onto the marble floor, reaching out to grab the hem of Martha's dress while begging for a mercy she had never shown to anyone else. However, Martha remained cold and immovable, pulling her skirt away with a look of pure disgust before signaling for the private security team to hold the woman in place. I stepped forward and presented a final set of laboratory results from a specialized toxicology report I had commissioned using my nursing credentials. The data clearly showed that Estelle had been mixing dangerously high doses of sedatives into Martha's evening tea to maintain total control over the penthouse. This was no longer just a civil matter of inheritance, because the evidence now pointed toward a calculated criminal attempt on a human life. Estelle looked around the room for an ally, but even her closest friends turned their faces away in shame after hearing the depth of her depravity. I looked down at the broken woman on the floor and spoke with a cold, unwavering voice. Everything you have stolen from my father and Leo today, I will take it all back without missing a single cent. Martha looked at the trembling figure and added with a tone of finality, I was wrong to ever place my trust in you, Estelle, and from this very second you are no longer a member of this family. The security guards moved in to secure the perimeter while Mr. Miller began the official process of notifying the authorities about the financial and medical crimes. I felt the immense weight of the last 2 years finally lifting off my shoulders as I realized that justice was no longer a distant dream. The penthouse, which had felt like a prison for so long, was finally being purged of the toxicity that had nearly destroyed our lives. I looked over at Martha and saw a spark of the old strength in her eyes, knowing that our family could finally begin the long process of healing. At 8:30 in the evening, the sharp wail of police sirens echoed loudly from the street below the high-rise building overlooking San Francisco Bay. The flashing red and blue lights reflected off the glass walls of the penthouse, signaling that the authorities had arrived to put a formal end to the night's chaos. A team of uniformed police officers entered the apartment with a sense of purpose, moving past the silent guests to speak directly with Mr. Miller. My lawyer immediately handed over the digital recording device and the extensive stack of documents that proved Estelle's involvement in both financial fraud and elder abuse. The officers reviewed the evidence briefly before approaching the head table where Estelle stood trembling with a mixture of rage and sheer terror. Estelle was quickly handcuffed and led toward the elevator right in front of the wealthy guests she had spent years trying to impress with her fake status. The sound of the metal cuffs clicking into place was the most satisfying noise I had heard since the day my father passed away and left us in her care. I watched as her socialite friends pulled back their expensive silk dresses to avoid any physical contact with her as she was escorted out of the room. Her face was twisted in a mask of desperation, but there was no one left in the ballroom willing to offer her a single word of support or comfort. Before the officers could reach the door, I stepped forward and instructed the building's private security team to gather every single one of Estelle's personal belongings from the master suite. I demanded that her designer bags and jewelry be cleared out and that she be removed from the property immediately in a state of total and utter public humiliation. The security staff moved quickly to fulfill my request, carrying out piles of luxury items that had been bought with money stolen from Leo's medical trust fund. Mr. Miller stood by my side and provided a quick summary of the legal consequences she would now face under the strict laws governing elder abuse and grand larceny. He explained that the combination of poisoning Martha and embezzling millions would likely result in a very long prison sentence without the possibility of an early release. Estelle let out a piercing scream as the police pulled her toward the hallway. You will never have a single moment of happiness. Willow and I will eventually come back to collect everything you think you have won today. I stood my ground and looked at her, with a calm sense of pity, before I replied. I truly wish you the best of luck in prison, Estelle, because there will be absolutely no one left for you to torment or deceive behind those iron bars. Once the elevator doors finally closed on her, the heavy atmosphere of the penthouse seemed to lighten almost instantly as the threat was finally removed from our lives. I walked back toward the center of the banquet hall and offered a sincere apology to the remaining guests for the dramatic turn the evening had taken. I took a deep breath and announced that the real celebration for Martha's birthday was only just beginning now that the house was finally at peace. The classical music resumed at a softer, more pleasant volume, and for the first time in years the laughter in the room felt genuine rather than forced. I looked over at Martha and saw her smiling at Leo's photograph, knowing that we had finally secured the future our father had always intended for us. Our long journey through the shadows had finally led us back into the light of the bay, where we could finally start to rebuild what was lost. 6 months after the family scandal finally came to an end, I stood before the window of my new executive office and looked down at the bustling rhythm of the city below. The view from this height was no longer a reminder of a golden cage, but rather a symbol of the freedom and justice we had fought so hard to reclaim. A thick legal update sat on my desk, confirming that Estelle had officially begun her 15-year prison sentence after her final appeal was denied by the state court. The judge had also ordered her to pay full restitution for every single dollar she had embezzled from our family over the last several years. This meant that the family inheritance was finally secured and would be used to build a future that actually honored my father's memory. The dark shadow that had loomed over our lives for so long was replaced by a sense of profound peace and structural stability. My younger brother Leo had recently undergone a complex and successful surgery, thanks to the specialized medical support provided by Mr. Dalton's Global Healthcare Corporation. He was currently recovering at a world-class rehabilitation center, where he spent his days regaining the strength that Estelle had tried so cruelly to take away. I visited him every morning before work and watched as he practiced walking without assistance, his eyes bright with the determination of a survivor. Mr. Dalton had become a trusted mentor to our family, often stopping by to check on our progress and ensure we had everything necessary for a full recovery. He saw the same potential in me that he saw on that rainy night on the highway, and he officially invited me to serve as the Chief Executive Officer of the city's Emergency Medical Relief Fund. Accepting this leadership role allowed me to use my professional nursing background to help thousands of families who were struggling with the same medical neglect we once faced. I spent my afternoons managing resources and coordinating with local hospitals to ensure that no patient would ever be denied care due to a lack of financial means. My grandmother Martha was now remarkably healthy and vibrant, frequently joining me in my charitable activities to make up for the dark months she spent in isolation. She had become a beloved figure in our community, using her wisdom and our family's resources to support elderly citizens who had been victims of similar domestic abuse. We often hosted weekend events at the penthouse, which was now filled with the warmth of genuine laughter and the presence of people who truly cared for one another. The penthouse no longer felt like a place of secrets and hidden poisons, but instead served as a sanctuary for those who needed a safe place to heal and rebuild their lives. I had learned that while truth can often be obscured by the blinding glare of money and social fame, a person's true dignity and kindness will always find a way to the light. Every decision I made now was guided by the integrity that my father had taught me before his passing, ensuring that his legacy would be defined by service rather than greed. My life was no longer about survival or revenge, but about creating a lasting impact that would protect other vulnerable people from the type of betrayal we had endured. As the sun began to set over the horizon, I felt a deep sense of gratitude for the strength that had carried us through the storm. Our story was a testament to the fact that justice might be delayed by deception, but it can never be completely extinguished by the hands of the wicked. I turned away from the window and returned to my work, ready to embrace the bright future that we had finally earned together. Before we end today's story, I want you to stay with me for a moment. What we have just witnessed is not just a family drama. It is a profound lesson about human dignity. My perspective is very clear. Money can buy a position, but it can never buy respect if one's heart is rotten. Willow has proven that even when pushed into a corner, integrity and self-reliance are the sharpest weapons to reclaim justice. I am truly outraged by Estelle's actions, but also quietly thankful that life always has people like Mr. Dalton to ensure justice is served. If you were in Willow's shoes, would you be calm enough to plan a counterattack, or would you crumble under such humiliation? Do you agree with Willow's firm decision not to reconcile in order to protect her brother? If you have a different perspective or a more clever way to handle this, please leave a comment below so we can discuss it. I sincerely thank all of you for taking the time to listen to Willow's story until the very end. Your support and heartfelt comments are the motivation for me to continue building more meaningful and humane content. Don't forget to hit the subscribe button and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next dramatic stories. Sincerely, and see you next time.